Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Broadcasting from the past and projecting into the future for another episode of the best of A View from the Bunker. This is the best of A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. I'm really rubbish at this. Well, history is not what we think it is. Much of what we have been taught about biblical history, especially that it's like myth and not real, happens not to be the case. Tonight, an episode that features 2 of my favorite interviews from the past 10 years of A View from the Bunker as we discuss why archaeology is cool. We'll take on the subject of the Exodus and the location of the biblical Sodom tonight in this archive special, Best of View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Thank you for tolerating the introduction tonight as I'm trying to get these put together before we head out of country. We will be back in just a few weeks, but until then, a couple more of these best of interviews, and I hope you appreciate them. These are people I've spoken to over the past 10 years who I thought really had something exceptionally interesting or important to say, and in some cases both. And so we thank you for taking the time to listen tonight, whether it's at Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher.com, Spotify.com. If you've subscribed to the podcast, we appreciate that. Just a reminder that you can do it at Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. Of course, you can also subscribe if you've got accounts at Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and we've got links to all of these places where you can subscribe and catch the pod every week at vftb.net. That is our homepage. Of course, the easy way to keep up with the podcast is to download the mobile app. It's absolutely free, works on iOS devices and Android devices, and we got links to both of those at the website, which is vftb.net. All this audio gets shipped over to YouTube as well, so if you like hanging out there, no video, of course, just, the audio, but still, you'll catch it at youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. And if you'd like to follow us on social media, we'd appreciate that. We're at Facebook. View from the Bunker is the name of the page, surprisingly enough. On Twitter, it's at View from Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. And the new social media site, by Christians for Christians. Try to keep up with the postings there, and that's oneway.com. Oneway.com. And you'll find me at Derek P. Gilbert. Well, why do we say history is not what we think it is? It's because archaeologists have had to make some assumptions about when certain things happened, and they use those as cornerstones for fitting everything else into a narrative timeline. But what if the assumptions are wrong? It can lead to some really bad conclusions, like, oh, the Bible is just a myth. Well, as I said, that happens not to be the case. And in March of 2016, we talked to maverick archaeologist and Egyptologist David Rohl. We live in an era when even Jews openly question the story of their national origins. But when you know how to parse the evidence and look for the evidence, it's all there. In fact, we even have a pretty good idea of what the patriarch Joseph and his coat of many colors looks like. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Our guest is an archaeologist and an Egyptologist, and I think it's fair to say that his work does not conform to the official timeline of ancient history. He's the author of a number of books, including A Test of Time, The Bible from Myth to History, Pharaohs and Kings, A Biblical Quest, From Eden to Exile, The 5,000-Year History of the People of the Bible. You begin to see a pattern here. The Lords of Avaris, Legend, The Genesis of Civilization, and most recently, Exodus, Myth or History. And he was one of the experts consulted by filmmaker Timothy Mahoney for his documentary film, Patterns of Evidence, The Exodus. We welcome David Rohl to the program. David, sir, it is truly an honor.
Great to be here, Derek.
Your work, I became aware of it through a friend almost 15 years ago who had pointed out that your work and your analysis of the archaeological evidence in Egypt and elsewhere in the ancient Near East kind of stood the official history on its head.
I think that's fair to say, actually, yes. In a sense, it's sort of turning the whole idea of how the timeline works in the ancient world upside down. And, of course, it's been very controversial as a result of that.
Yeah, this, I presume, I'm not a scholar, but my wife was involved in academia for a time as an adult. She went back to college, got her degree as an adult, and so she saw the world of academia and tenure and publishing and peer review with perhaps more experienced eyes than many students who are just coming up straight through grad school. The kind of work that you've done and the way you have rewritten the timeline of history, that's not necessarily a way to get tenure or grant funding, is it?
Not really in the history disciplines. That's absolutely true, yes. History as a subject tends to be looking backwards, of course, because historians look back to the past and do their analysis based on archaeological evidence if it's the BC period. And so when you tend to have a group of people who don't like change very much. And so when you come along with a radical new idea, it really is very difficult to get it accepted within the academic circle.
So just to give folks an idea of where or how your view of history and how you fit the evidence into the timeline of history compared to the the accepted or standard chronology. How does your new chronology differ?
Well, the first thing to understand about the way that time works in the BC period is, of course, you're working backwards in time. You're looking backwards towards the past. And we start from the date of the birth of Christ, which we usually consider to be 1 AD or 1 BC, whichever way you want to look at it. There is no zero in the timeline. And of course, we date everything today by using our AD chronology. We use the number of years from the birth of Christ. So we're in 2016th year since the birth of Christ. That's how we work things out. But if you lived in the BC period before Christ was born, you didn't know Christ was going to get born, so therefore you couldn't have a chronology based on the number of years before Christ was born. So they had a different method of dating. They used what we call regnal dating, which means they dated things to the reigns of the kings. So, for instance, in the 5th year of Ramesses II, he fought the great battle of Kadesh against the Hittites from Anatolia. So we use that 5th year as our dating. But we, of course, as historians, try to then put a BC date on that. And we do that by back calculating, adding up the reigns, the different kings going back through the dynasties, right the way back to the time of Ramesses. And we get a date of 1279 BC for the 1st year of Ramesses. That's all calculated. But of course, if we've made our sums wrong, if we've added it all up wrongly or incorrectly or misunderstood the data, then that date could be wrong as well. And so everything would change. And that's basically what I did. What I found was that, believe it or not, the Egyptologists had used a biblical date, a biblical synchronism, to date the time of a pharaoh. The pharaoh was called Shoshenq I, and he's the first king of the 22nd dynasty. That's after the time of Ramesses II, who's a 19th dynasty king. And they used a synchronism in the Bible, which says that both in Kings and Chronicles, it says that a pharaoh called Shishak came up to Jerusalem and plundered the temple of its treasures in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. In the 5th year, that's 5 years after Solomon died. Now, we get that date of 925 BC from the Bible. We use the Bible to give us that date of 925 BC. And what Egyptologists did was they borrowed that date and applied it to this king Shoshenq of the 22nd dynasty. And the whole of Egyptian chronology then hangs on this biblical date. So that's how it was structured. I happen to believe that this Pharaoh Shishak of the Bible that sacked the Temple of Solomon is not Pharaoh Shoshenq of the 22nd dynasty. And once you break that link, then the whole game is up. You've got a whole new horizon to look at, a whole new set of data to rework into a different way.
Now, as I understand ancient Egyptian chronology, there were periods where you had multiple pharaohs, sort of like, following the history of the Vatican, where there were times where you had multiple popes,
That's
anti-popes,
right.
and so forth. And if you make the assumption that all of the men who claimed the title pharaoh, just as with the popes, reigned in sequential order, you could wind up with a real mess if you don't account for the fact that some of them were reigning concurrently at the same time.
Well, that's exactly what happened. Egyptologists treated a period we call the Third Intermediate Period, which is from the 21st dynasty to the 25th dynasty. So again, after Ramesses II, who's a 19th dynasty pharaoh, New Kingdom pharaoh, they treated those dynasties as sequential, basically, although they knew that they were aware of some overlapping, but they didn't do sufficient overlapping. So they ended up with an overextended chronology, pushing the dates further and further back. So Ramesses ended up much further back in time than I think he should have been. And that's a calculation that they made. And yes, you're quite absolutely right. We know that the way that the politics of ancient Egypt worked, the Nile Valley is a long, going from south to north river valley. And so you ended up in certain periods where different kingdoms were ruling in different parts of Egypt at different times. So you would have some parts of what, let's say, the 22nd dynasty were contemporary with the 23rd dynasty, and parts of the 22nd dynasty were contemporary with the 25th dynasty. But what they never try to allow for in their calculations is the idea that perhaps the 21st dynasty was also contemporary with the 22nd dynasty. And that takes a huge chunk of time out of the calculation. It means that Ramesses II comes down by about 200 years.
Now let's go back to Shishak and Shoshenq.
Yeah.
I mean, to English speakers, those names sound alike. So how do you conclude that they are not the same person?
Well, there's lots of reasons. What happened was Champollion, the famous first translator of the hieroglyphs in 1822, he went to Egypt for the first time with the Bible in one hand and his translation in another hand of the decoding of the hieroglyphs, and tried to find evidence for synchronisms between the Bible and Egypt. And he went to Karnak and he actually found there a relief, an inscription of this king Shoshenq I of the 22nd dynasty, where he'd campaigned in Canaan or Palestine or whatever you want to call it. And he saw one name ring of one place that he conquered in that period, which he read as Judah the Kingdom, Yudaham al-Kuth. Now, he was just at the beginnings of the translation process. We now know that he misread that name. It really means hand of the king, Yad Hamelech. But even though he'd made that mistake, identifying it as Judah the Kingdom, he then went on to think, well, this is the synchronism between Rehoboam in year 5 and Shishak. This is the plundering of the kingdom of Judah by the Pharaoh, Shishak. And that synchronism has been stuck ever since, even though we know that the name was mistranslated. The name ring was mistranslated. We also know that Shoshenq's campaign was actually, when you actually look at the itinerary of the campaign on the relief, you find that he was campaigning in the northern kingdom, northern kingdom of Israel, which is in fact at the time of Shishak was the ally of Egypt and the enemy of Judah. So it's topsy-turvy. It's a completely upside-down situation. The Egyptian pharaoh Shoshenq was campaigning in the north. The biblical pharaoh Shishak was campaigning in the south. It's a complete contradiction.
So how do we reconcile it then? Where do you reset the timelines of the Bible versus the Egyptian king lists, and from there, how do we then extrapolate into the wider history of the ancient Near East?
That's a really good question. It starts by not using the Bible today in Egypt. You use the internal Egyptian evidence, the archaeological evidence and the inscriptional evidence, to work backwards in time, working from our last fixed point in history, which is 664 BC, when the Assyrians sacked the city of Thebes. Now, that's a fixed point. We don't have any problem with that. And then you have to piece together the dynasties and the kings going back through the Third Intermediate Period until you get to the New Kingdom and Ramesses II. That's the only way to do it. And when I did that, I constructed it, and this is what the basis of my PhD thesis was, reconstructing those 5 dynasties. I found that Ramesses II was around 300 years later in time towards the present than you would have in the conventional dating system. And that put him in the 10th century. Now, obviously, the 10th century is the time of King Solomon when it comes to the biblical chronology.
Right, yeah.
So I thought, well, hang on a minute then. Ramesses II, everybody thinks is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the time of Moses. Here he is now, sitting in the time of Solomon. And who was the Pharaoh who sacked the Temple of Solomon? It's the Pharaoh called Shishak. And then I discovered that the Ramesses II had what we call a hypochoristicon, or a shortened form of his name, that the ordinary people called him. In other words, he didn't have this posh name, Ramesses Uzamatre Setepenre Ramesses Meriamun, his official title, which you see on the inscriptions. That they had a normal name for him. Like, for instance, you'd have, for instance, Lady Di for Princess Diana, or Good Queen Bess for Queen Elizabeth. These short-form names. Yeah. Local people call great people by these short-form names. You know, Teddy Roosevelt. You know, that sort of thing. So these abbreviated name forms. And what we found was that Ramesses, based on his name that we heard in the Semitic languages, which is Ria-Meshisha, that's how it's pronounced in the Semitic languages, that the end form of that, Shisha, was actually his hyperchoristigon, his nickname.
Oh, okay.
And Shisha is almost identical to Shishak.
Yes. Okay.
So then we find that an inscription with Ramesses II saying that he fought against Israelites. So it all fits.
Okay, so Ramses was an enemy of the Israelites, just not during the Charlton Heston era.
Exactly correct. He got a really bad press by being the pharaoh of the Exodus, when in fact he was the plunderer of Solomon's temple.
How about that? Okay. I was watching the DVD, the lectures, two of the lectures that from your last fall up in Minnesota.
Correct.
And you made a point, and I thought this was a brilliant piece of detective or deductive reasoning, detective work, if you will, regarding the year 1362 BC.
Okay.
How does that? Why is that important, and how does that influence the timeline?
Well, it's all to do with Babylonian chronology now. We're getting to something quite complicated, but there's something called the year of the Golden Throne, which appears in the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, who's one of the kings of Babylon I, the first dynasty of Babylon, otherwise known as the Old Babylonian period. Now, this is the era of King Hammurabi, the famous writer of the Law Code. Everybody probably knows about him. Yeah. And Ammi-Saduqa was a successor of Hammurabi. And we were able to, using what's called Venus solutions, the cycle of the Venus solutions, using astronomy, to calculate the likely date for the year of the Golden Throne in Ammi-Saduqa's year 8. And from that, we could then back calculate to the time of Hammurabi by counting the years in the king's list for each king to get a date for Hammurabi. Now, amazingly, we got a synchronism between Hammurabi in Egypt because we know he was a contemporary of a pharaoh called Neferhotep of the 13th dynasty. So suddenly we have a method using astronomy, using Babylonian data to actually find a date for a 13th dynasty pharaoh in Egypt. So the whole thing sort of locked together beautifully. And it resulted, if you think about 1362, that's roughly the time of Moses.
Yeah.
So, you're looking at something very interesting going on here, because all these little bits of information you can get from using computer programming to back calculate dates of events, solar eclipses and Venus solutions or whatever the particular thing is you're looking for. And we found lots of solar eclipses and lunar eclipses that fit into this scheme and seem to solidify it. We then end up with a chronology which is based on several different disciplines: astronomy, Babylonian chronology, Egyptology, ancient Egyptian chronology, all these things, and of course the Bible, all fitting together beautifully.
So how does that, then calculating backward from that 1362 date, how does that sync with the expected date of the Exodus?
Okay, well, 1362 is the date of Ammi-Saduqa. If you have to go back then to Hammurabi, he's much, much earlier because he's several kings earlier than Ammi-Saduqa, and they had long reigns. So what we end up doing is we get Neferhotep now somewhere, let's say, in the 15th century BC. Okay, now 15th century BC is a big sort of like message point for everybody, because we all know that the Exodus took place in around 1450 BC. Not the 1250 BC of Ramesses II, but if you read your Bible, it's 480 years before the fourth year of King Solomon, when he laid the foundation stones of the temple in Jerusalem. Back calculate from 970 BC, which is the first year of Solomon, the 480 years minus 4, and you end up with roughly 1447 BC for the Exodus. That's the Bible's date for the Exodus. And now we're in the 15th century BC. Now, that's the time we find Hammurabi around. That's the time we find Neferhotep around in Egypt. And if we then back calculate through the 13th dynasty pharaohs, we end up with a time of Joseph and the Israelite arrival in Egypt with Jacob and the tribes, roughly around 1632, around that period. So in the 12th dynasty, at the end of the 12th dynasty. So everything can lock together, and we can now find the era between the arrival of the Israelites in the late 12th dynasty and the departure of the Israelites after the sojourn and slavery in the time of a king called Ka-Nefer-Sobekotep, who was the brother of Neferhotep I. So we can actually lock down that era of the Exodus from the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt to their departure.
Now, I have to confess being a little confused here. The arrival of Joseph, 1632, roughly 200 years before the Exodus. I somehow got the idea that there was 400 years of sojourn in Egypt.
That's a really good question. A lot of people get confused by that. if you look at the different sources, biblical sources, don't forget you don't just have the King James Version of the Bible, the English translation, and all the other translations that have come out of that genre. You also have the original Septuagint, the Greek version of the Bible, which of the Old Testament, which was written by a group of rabbis, scholars who were brought to Egypt to write the Old Testament down in Greek for the Ptolemies, the Greek pharaohs, for the Alexandrian Library. And that is actually one of our oldest sources for the Bible material. You also have the Aramaic Bible as well, which again is different. And you have Josephus also writing the story of the history of the Jews. So we have different sources. All the other sources, except for the Masoretic text, which is the one that evolves into the King James, etc., the Hebrew version, all of those other versions tell us that the 430 years that was spent from the time of Abraham's arrival in Canaan to Moses' departure at the Exodus. It's not the period when Jacob arrives in Egypt to Moses. It's the entire period from the promise that God gave to Abraham that his people would be given the promised land to the time that Moses departed with the people out of Egypt. That was 430 years. And if you look at the genealogies in the Bible, you'll see that the time from, let's say, from Joseph through to Moses is only about 4 generations in the Bible. So we think that we can divide it into 2 halves, roughly 215 years from Abraham down to the arrival of Jacob in the famine years, the second year of the famine, and then around 250 years from then to the Exodus. That adds up to 430. So what's happened in the Masoretic text, and we see it in the English translations, is it says that the Israelites sojourned not just in the land of Egypt for 430 years, but in the land of Canaan and Egypt. And the word Canaan has dropped out of the text in the Masoretic version. It's there in the Septuagint. It's there in Josephus. It's there in the Aramaic Bible. It's just missing from the Masoretic text.
Okay, that explains that. So now you gave us the long name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus then.
Yes.
So what was and I understand there's a shorter version of that name.
Well, there's two people we've got to deal with here. The first one is the one that actually raised Moses in the palace. And we have a source for that. Artaparnos, the Jewish historian, tells us that the Pharaoh who raised Moses, in other words, whose daughter actually fished him out of the River Nile and raised him as a prince of Egypt, he was called Kenophres in Greek. That's what Artaparnos calls him. And we know that to be an Egyptian pharaoh called Kar-Neferre. His full name is Kar-Neferre Sobekotep IV. And he was the brother of Neferhotep, who I mentioned earlier. So he comes immediately after Neferhotep. That's the time when Moses is born. Then, of course, we have the approximately 80 years before the Exodus, because Moses gets exiled after 40 years, after he goes into Sinai, and he comes back after another 40 years, and that's when the Exodus takes place. So 80 years further on down the road, we have another pharaoh, who's the actual pharaoh of the Exodus, and his name in the 13th dynasty is Dudimose. And we actually have him also mentioned in another source called Manetho, who again wrote for the Ptolemies, the Greek pharaohs, in Greek, and he calls him Tutimeus, which is the Greek form of Dudimose. So we have 2 pharaohs who we can actually say were involved in Moses' life, the one who raised him and the one who fought him at the time of Exodus.
You also pointed out that now, and this was fascinating to see the connections here and see how the evidence links so even more perfectly with the biblical account than I expected, and that was in the research that was done, the digs that were done at Avaris, and the discovery of what appears to be a tomb of a very important person, but not an Egyptian person.
Right. This is all about this new redating, because when I said to you before that we ended up with Joseph and Jacob being at the end of the 12th dynasty, arriving in Egypt and settling in Egypt, we actually find at this place called Tel Edaba is the modern name of the site, but the ancient name is Avaris. And it's actually a city that was built, and then Ramesses II built another city later on, hundreds of years later, on top of it, called Ramesses, which is why the Bible refers to the Israelites sojourning in a place called Ramesses. But it's actually the city underneath Ramesses that they sojourned in. So you have these Israelites coming in to Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty in the reign of a king called Amenemhat III. And we actually see that in the archaeology. The Austrians who've been excavating this site since the 60s found the beginnings of a little village of around 100 people, maybe 15 houses, at this spot. And it was the first, village there. And then after a short period, a palace was built on this place, surrounded by these houses. And the village began to expand into a larger and larger town. Eventually, it would end up with a city of around 30,000 people, most of whom were Semites, who were what we would call Israelites. And this palace at the heart of this city was an Egyptian palace, but it was occupied by somebody who wasn't Egyptian. And the reason we know this is because in the back of the palace there was a garden which became a cemetery, and in it there were 12 main tombs, and they were all tombs of Semites, people who had Semitic pottery, Canaanite pottery. They had weapons that were not Egyptian. They were buried in a way that the Egyptians are not buried, a different way, which we could typically say is Canaanite or Asiatic, Western Asiatic. And then there was one particular tomb in this cemetery, or one of the 12, which was actually a pyramid tomb, and that was extremely unusual. When the archaeologists found this, they were flabbergasted, because they realized that at this time only pharaohs had pyramid tombs. Nobody else would be given one. Yet this guy, who was clearly not a pharaoh, he did have a small palace, and he was some very high official of state, and he was a Semite, and he lived in the place called Avaris, which is in the land of Goshen, as we know from not only the biblical text, but also the Egyptian text as well. And he had a pyramid tomb. And when they excavated the tomb, they found that it had a chapel on the front of the pyramid, a mortuary chapel. And when they looked inside the mortuary chapel, they found the broken fragments of a colossal statue, which was probably something in the region of about 8 feet tall. And it was a seated statue. And when they found the head of the statue, they noticed that he had yellow skin. Now, normally Egyptians paint their figures of Egyptians with dark brown skin. And the people they represent with yellow skin are what we call Semites or Western Asiatics. So it was quite clear from this that this high official who lived in the palace and had a pyramid tomb was a Semite. And then they checked his hair, and the hair on the statue was red. So, and that's not an Egyptian trait either.
No.
Okay, but there are one or two Israelites in the patriarchal stories with red hair, so we started to think this is interesting. So that started to get interesting, and then they found that on the back shoulder of this statue, or the fragments of it, there was paint left, more paint, and this paint could just about make out that he was wearing a striped coat of multicolours. So all these things together, we have a Western Asiatic Semite with red hair, yellow skin, and a multicolored coat on. And he's living in the land of Goshen soon after this village is formed here, and he just fitted the bill perfectly for Joseph. And then they ended up excavating the actual burial chamber of the pyramid, and they found there was no coffin in there. There was no body. There was no pottery. There was no jewelry. There was nothing you would normally expect in a burial inside the burial chamber. And they noticed that there was a tunnel leading from the chapel behind the statue going into the burial chamber beneath the pyramid, and somebody had clearly in antiquity had gone into the burial chamber and removed the body of the person buried in there. And if you know your book of Genesis, one of the last acts of the book of Genesis is Joseph on his deathbed, gathering around his deathbed the rest of the people of the village, and saying to them, look, when you eventually leave Egypt, and I know you're going to leave, take my body with you. And that's exactly what Moses did on the date of Exodus. He went and he got the coffin of Joseph, removed it from his tomb, and he took him all the way through the wandering years and had him reburied at Shechem in the promised land following the conquest. And so this tomb in Egypt matched exactly with the story of Joseph.
And a reconstruction of that statue is on the cover of a couple of editions of your works, Pharaohs and Kings, right, and A Test of Time. And of course, I'll put the image in the show notes at vftb.net so people can see what we're seeing. It's really remarkable to think that here we are 3,500 years later, and we have very possibly a very good idea of what Joseph the patriarch looked like and how he may have dressed back in the day.
It's our best guess at what he looked like. I mean, what we did was, because we know that Joseph was the vizier of Egypt, and the viziers had a particular form of cloak or gown that they wore. So we actually looked at statues from the Middle Kingdom from the time of the 12th dynasty, and we compared them, and we looked at the fragments of the statue, and we were able to reconstruct what the seated figure would have looked like using a vizier's coat, using the paint fragments that were found on the back shoulder, looking at the collar, the paint fragments from the collar around the neck and all those things, and we were able to reconstruct him based on typical Middle Kingdom statuary. So it's as close as you're going to get, basically.
You also pointed out an ancient waterwork canal that had been dug that is known even to this day in Arabic as the Waterway of Joseph. What was that about, and how might that have affected Joseph's standing in the ancient Egyptian kingdom?
Well, when we realized that this palace and this tomb were dated to the end of the 12th dynasty, we started looking at what was happening in the events of the kings of that time. And as I said earlier on, it seems that Joseph was actually the vizier during the reign of a king called Amenemhat III, who was perhaps the most powerful king of the 12th dynasty. And when we were looking at the work that was involved in his reign, we found that in order to prevent what was an obvious famine going on in his time, because we can see that in the way that his face is depicted in the statues of the king, that he's got worry lines, he's looking concerned for his people. We then found that there was some very peculiar things going on in his reign, including the project of diverting a huge amount of water out of the River Nile into something called the Fayum Basin, which is to the west side of the river in the Sahara. And what happened was a canal was constructed from the River Nile to act as a sump to pour huge quantities of water out of the River Nile that was going to flood the regions to the north and take it into the Fayum. Now, we know that the famine in the time of Amenemhat III was caused by excessive floodwater. What happened was, for a period of years, the waters flooded the land for such a long period of time in the summer that they were unable to plant their crops because the fields were waterlogged. Mm-hmm. And so for several years, they couldn't plant crops. And so what Joseph, or whoever it was that did this work in the reign of Amenemhat III, what he did was he diverted 50% of the water into this basin to reduce the water level so that people could replant the crops again. And this waterway that, as you mentioned, that was cut to do this work is still called today the Waterway of Joseph, Bar Yosef, and it has been for donkey's years. So there's a nice connection there between this pharaoh Amenemhat III, who built his pyramid looking down on this canal, and our biblical figure Joseph.
That's phenomenal. I'm looking at some images of Amenemhat III, and there are quite a few surviving images of this particular pharaoh.
Yeah, he was a bigwig. He was a really big, important pharaoh. Yeah. But in spite of the fact he was incredibly powerful and rich, when you look at his face, can you see the worry lines? Can you see the fact that he looks careworn? He doesn't look like the usual bland, smiley pharaoh that you see all the other times. In this one era, you find the pharaohs are looking miserable. They are not looking happy people. They're not happy bunnies. So we have to explain that. And what art historians do, they look at this and say, this is because Egypt was suffering at this time, and he's showing the concern for his people. He's showing that he, like the people, is suffering in the same way the people are. And so they've concluded that, well along with these excessive waters they found, that there must have been a ginormous famine at this time. Mm-hmm. And that, again, fits the biblical story of Joseph. Yeah. The other thing that really stands out, pardon the pun, are his ears. He's depicted in almost all of these having rather prodigious ears on both sides of that the pharaoh's head garb. Well noted. Well, that again is very interesting because on the backs of temples in Egypt, you would find carved onto the back wall a pair of ears. And what happens is the ordinary people who could not go into the temples because they were not allowed in the Holy of Holies would go to the back of the temple and they would speak to the ears and ask the gods to give them good luck and good harvests, etc. So when you see that on a pharaoh, he's saying, come and tell me your problems. Come and tell me your concerns. I'm here to listen to you because I know you're suffering. That's what that's all about. Okay. Now, Amenemhat seems to have been a pretty good politician then as well. Well, I think he comes across quite well in the Bible, doesn't he? He certainly does. Yeah, I think he's a pretty cool pharaoh. He's not like the pharaoh of the Exodus much later on. Yeah. There's an interesting period of Egyptian history, and I had always thought that this period where Egypt is overrun by foreign
invaders, Asiatic invaders, the Hyksos, had to have something to do with the Exodus, that maybe the period when the Hyksos left Egypt was, maybe that was the period of time in which all of the Israelites left as well, maybe not as part of the main body of Hyksos, who were not necessarily Israelite, Semitic, but not Israelite. How does this strange interlude in Egyptian history, do we see any evidence of that in the Bible? Is that part of the Exodus, or is it some other episode altogether?
Well, it's a theory that's been going around for a long time, and in fact Josephus is the one that first mentions it. The idea that the Hyksos, when they left Egypt, are the Israelites leaving Egypt at the Exodus. That was something he suggested. But what we've discovered is a little bit more subtle than that. What we found at this city of Avaris, over a period of maybe several hundred years, which it was occupied, that there were two types of Semites. There were the earlier ones who came in and formed this little village and it evolved into this 30,000 population city. Now, those people were highly Egyptianized. Although they were Semites, they adopted the Egyptian culture. They were very different to the ones that came later. And then we find that at the end of the 13th dynasty in this city, there's a terrible plague that strikes where we have death pits all over the place and people are thrown into these death pits. And then immediately afterwards, these Semites who've been living there for a couple of centuries simply close the doors of their houses, pack their bags and leave. They disappear. And then there's a little lacuna of about maybe 10 years where we notice in the archaeology the houses are starting to crumble and things get dilapidated. Nobody's living there. And then there's this tremendous invasion from the north of these people we call the Hyksos. And they charge in with their chariots and their horses, and they occupy this city of Avaris that had been abandoned, and they flatten the whole place, that like all the village houses are all knocked down, and they build this ginormous necropolis, burial site on top of it. Now, these guys are not Egyptianized. They're highly Asiatic. They're not Egyptianized in any way. They are warriors. They come in, and when they're buried, they actually kill the servants and the concubines and bury them next to the body of the warrior. They're completely different types of Asiatics. And what most scholars haven't realized is we have two phases of Semites. We have the Israelite phase, who leave at the end of the 13th dynasty. Then we have the Hyksos coming in and literally wiping out the Egyptians and suppressing them. And that is the punishment of God at the end of Exodus. So in other words, not only do we have the 10 plagues, but after the 10 plagues, the Egyptian army is then destroyed in the Red Sea. As you know, they are defenseless. They have no way to protect themselves from an invading horde. And that's exactly what happens. These Hyksos come in as an invading horde. They've got nobody to defend Egypt, and they take over the place.
Well, there are other aspects of the ancient Near East and ancient Near Eastern history that I find fascinating. And someday, maybe if we have the opportunity, I'd like to talk with you about Eridu and Babylon and the temple.
That's all good stuff.
The temple of Enki.
We can talk about Trojan War as well, which is also good fun, because all these things have implications for this revised dating system.
Exactly, but don't want to drift too far away from the topic of your most recent book, dealing with the Exodus. But of course, the consequence of the Exodus was the creation of the nation of Israel. And I do want to, move forward a couple centuries to the time of Saul and David.
Sure. Because
one of the things that I found most startling about your work years ago was your analysis based on the new chronology of the Amarna letters, the tablets found at Tel Amarna. Talk about those and what you concluded about the state of Canaan in the time of the Amarna letters.
Okay, that's another fascinating subject. Again, it's a consequence of having this time shift. Because if we're lowering the time of Ramesses II down to the time of Solomon, it means now that this Amarna period of Akhenaten, the famous heretic pharaoh, lands us right at the time of King Saul and the early years of King David. The first 7 years when he's not in Jerusalem, but he's in Hebron, ruling separately in Hebron. He doesn't conquer Jerusalem until his 7th year. So that era between Saul and the first 7 years of David is the time of Akhenaten in Egypt on this new dating scheme. Now, what's amazing is, of course, that most scholars would argue that Akhenaten was the first monotheist, the first king to worship one God.
Right.
But we've already discovered that Moses, in fact, now predates Akhenaten by a couple of centuries, because we've got him in the 13th dynasty. He's no longer the time of Ramesses, which is after Akhenaten. He's before Akhenaten, a long way before Akhenaten. So what is Akhenaten all about? What is this monotheism? What is he worshipping? Well, he's worshipping the light of the sun. That's what the Aten is. There's some arguments even to say that perhaps in his later years he was even blind. We're not even sure about that. But the point is that during his time there was a revolution in Egypt, a religious revolution. He banned all the other gods. He worshipped a single god. And what happened was he allowed the empire that had been created by the great kings of the 18th dynasty to completely collapse, because he was not interested in international policy, in diplomacy. He wasn't interested in having a military force out there protecting the kingdom and all the rest of it. So we end up in a situation where there's a rising in Canaan of people called the Habiru. Now, these are mentioned in the letters, the correspondence from the city-state rulers of Canaan, writing to Akhenaten saying, for God's sake, send us some troops. We're being attacked. We're being killed and murdered in our beds. Even when we flee to the gates of Egypt, we're being murdered at the gates of Egypt by these Habiru. Now, who the heck are these Habiru? Now, obviously, if you look at your biblical story, this is the time of the revolt of the Israelites, the Hebrews, against the Philistines. In the time of King Saul and Jonathan, his son, where they overthrow the Philistine overlordship and they create the kingdom of Israel under King Saul, the first king of Israel. And so this is the opportunity when Akhenaten is ignoring the empire. Up comes Saul and says, right, this is my time. This is when we can snatch the kingdom and create a kingdom, a monarchy in Israel, rather than just having a tribal confederacy. Now we can have a kingdom of Israel. And of course, that leads to David and it leads to Solomon. So this is the beginning, the birth of the kingdom of Israel in the time of King Saul, when Akhenaten was not doing his job in protecting the empire from insurgency like that.
Reading the texts, the translations of these Amarna letters is like reading, you're right, dispatches from the front lines begging for help. And it's fascinating reading, especially even just the format of these letters, where those who write to Akhenaten are saying, I bow before my king 7 times and 7 times, and that very formal letter. Yeah, we could do with a little more of that in our modern world. But
absolutely true. Yeah, and of course, the idea of 7 times 7 is always in the Bible as well.
Yes,
you get that in the Bible.
Yes, very intriguing. It all connects together. The Bible was not written in a vacuum.
Absolutely not.
What is it about those letters? Where do you find clues in those letters, though, that the rulers of these city-states are specifically begging for help against the likes of Saul, David, Saul's son? How do you identify them in those letters?
Okay, that's where we get a little bit more complicated. What you have to realize is that those first 3 kings of Israel, that's Saul, David, and Solomon, they may not be the names that they carried in life. Now, let's look at the name of Solomon, for instance. We know what that is. That the word means peace. And what happens in Solomon's reign? Well, he has 40 years of peace. There are no wars in Solomon's time, okay? David means the beloved. Now, that name, it could be just simply a biblical name for him, but we do have that name, does occur in the ancient world, so it is possible that is his real name that he had in life. That is entirely possible. Solomon, on the other hand, if you read your Bibles, you'll find that he was also called Jedediah. So maybe Jedediah was his real name, and Solomon was his legendary name that was given to him later on. That's entirely possible. Now, when we come to Saul, the name Saul means asked for. Shaul means asked for in the Bible. And of course, what is the most famous thing about the first king of Israel is that the people went to Samuel and asked him for a king. The king was asked for by the people, which is what Shaul means. So we know that Shaul is probably a legendary name. It's probably not the real name that he carried when he was born and carried through life. Now, when we look at the Amarna letters, we have to look for somebody who was a king who ruled in the hill country of the Holy Land, that is the whole area north and south of Jerusalem, also north around in the area of Galilee and the hills up there, and also crossing Transjordan where the other tribes were. That was the sphere of influence of this King Saul. Now we look for a character in the Amarna letters, and we find one who rules in exactly those areas, and he is the leader of the Habiru, who were attacking the city-states on the coast of the plain, who we would identify as the Philistine kings, the ones writing to Akhenaten saying, these Habiru are coming down and murdering us in our beds. And, of course, David is the most famous Habiru. He's the one who actually went and signed up to be a mercenary for the king of Gath.
Right.
Okay. And that is exactly what these letters are saying, that these kings in Gath and Ashkelon and other places are all saying, our Habiru mercenaries are killing us. So you've got this wonderful complexity of things going on. Now, who is this king that rules in the same area as Saul and is the leader of the Habiru? Well, his name in the Amarna letters is Labaya or Labayu. Mm-hmm. And Labai or Laba is the word for great lion in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Ariel is ordinary lion, and Labai is a great lion, a mighty lion. Now, we don't know whether Labaya means the lion of Yah, in other words, the lion of Yahweh. That is a possibility, though it's not certain. But when we start to read the letters that he wrote to Akhenaten, and we start to read the letters of other kings who are writing to Pharaoh saying what Labaya is up to, it's amazing because they match the story of Saul perfectly. So it's you can read about him, for instance, taking his hometown back from the Philistines in his own letters to Pharaoh. Now, that is exactly what Saul did. Saul and Jonathan seized back Geba, the town of the capital of Saul, from the Philistines who had taken it. So it matches Saul there. Another letter, he's accused of his son, Labia's son, associating with the Habiru rebels, the Habiru chieftain, who's the main rebel who's fighting against the Philistines. Now, we know that's David in this sense because he's out there and he's doing all this brigandry stuff, and he's actually against Saul for most of the time. But, of course, it's Saul's son Jonathan who's actually David's best friend in this period.
Right.
And so Labaya writes to Pharaoh and saying, I did not know my son was consorting with the Habiru. I just found out about it. You told me and I wasn't aware about it. And you get exactly the same thing in the biblical story, because Saul says to his son that he's a son of a wanton. In other words, his mother, how dare he go off consorting with David, because your throne, your entitlement, when I die, you will lose it to this guy David who you can't trust. Mm-hmm. And so the stories match up exactly. And then later on, we find that Saul and Jonathan die on Mount Gilboa in the great famous battle against the Philistines, which David doesn't get involved in. And that's exactly what happened to Labaya. He also died in that very same area. And so the stories seem to match up absolutely perfectly. So as long as you're prepared to accept the fact that Saul is his biblical legendary name, and we've got to look for his original real name, Labaya, the Lion of Yah, or whatever it might mean, then you can see the matches between the two stories.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And there are references to other characters as well, Joab, Yeshaiah, possibly David's father Jesse. It's
and, of course, David himself, who appears in one letter called as Dadua, which means the beloved.
Yeah, it's amazing when you step back and take a look with fresh eyes and say, okay, let's throw out our preconceptions and deal with the evidence. Apart from these assumptions that have been calcified into the study of ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East, how well the evidence actually does support it. And of course, in our modern world, there are serious political implications because the right of Israel to its land is in large part based upon the biblical account and the fact that, God gave the land to the Israelites. If we can establish an archaeological basis for a presence in the land prior to, say, the return from the Babylonian captivity, that establishes, the political implications in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle.
Well, that you see is a very interesting situation because actually things have transmogrified over the years. When the idea of creating a land of Israel for the Jews first came into fruition, at that time, people did believe that the conquest was a real event in history.
Yes.
And people have believed that for centuries and centuries. There it is in the Joshua narratives. that they took the land by force, and it was promised to Abraham by God, and therefore it belongs to the Jews. And then, of course, with everybody in academia turning around and saying, well, actually, the conquest never did happen, and actually the Exodus never happened, and there was no Moses and there was no Joshua, the raison d'etre changed. Because then what happened was academics argued, that the Israelites had never been in Egypt. They had always been in Canaan, and they actually came out of the land. In other words, they were indigenous to the land, the promised land, the land of Israel, and therefore they have it by right of the fact that they were always there. Okay, so that is the current way that it's argued. Okay, now I come along and say, well, actually, there was a Moses, there was a Joseph, there was an exodus of people from Egypt, slaves who became the nation of Israel, and they really did conquer the land by force under Joshua. So then you get to the modern political idea that actually taking a land by force does not legitimize your rights to the land. Yeah. So you get into this all very modern complexity of what is morally right and what is not right, according to ancient ways of doing things and modern ways of doing things. Today, you could not conquer a land and say, it's mine because I've conquered it, without the whole world coming down on you like a ton of bricks.
Right.
So in a sense, we have to put our ancient hats on and think about what it was like in the ancient times, when the world was entirely different to what it is today. And so the conquest of the promised land was promised to the Israelites, and they had to take it by force, and they had to kill an awful lot of people to do it.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. We're looking at, we often tend to read history. We certainly read the Bible through 21st century filter, and that means we're reading it with and not with the intent that the authors of the history, the authors of the Bible intended at the time. We're not reading it with their worldview, their understanding of the nature of human relations and so forth. I like to joke that we can take this beyond a point where it's rational anymore. I mean, here in America, of course, we are very much aware that we took the land away from the native inhabitants. But at some point, we know that they actually crossed the land bridge from Siberia and took the land away from perhaps people who were here prior to that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely. I am of Swedish and English and Welsh descent. So basically, I represent all of the factions that fought over Great Britain back in the day. So I'm demanding reparations for myself. So
absolutely, that's brilliant. And in fact, one of the hardest things a historian of the ancient world has to do is get his head into the ancient world. In other words, understand ancient man and how they thought about things, because they didn't have science, they didn't have the things that we have today. And you're right, the whole way of thinking was completely different. The way that people passed knowledge from A to B was quite often through conquest, or at least communicating through trade with your neighbor. Mm-hmm. And so the world functioned in a very different way. And you can even look at the New Testament and see how different the world was then in Roman times to the time of Moses. It's a completely different world. And Jesus is there in a different world, and he adapts his teachings to the world that's around him. Not the world of Moses. So, although he continues to quote Moses, and he quotes the Torah and all the rest of it, but his teachings are somewhat different because he's teaching in a different era. He's teaching the people a new way of understanding God and understanding through Christianity, a different way to perhaps the way of Moses.
Mm-hmm. And looking back 2 millennia hence, we see that because he was teaching in that world, as was the Apostle Paul and Peter and the other writers of the epistles, they were dealing with people in their day and age. They didn't address an issue that's always top of mind here in the United States, of slavery, because the concept of slavery was very different in first century Rome, or the first century Roman Empire, than it was in 19th and 20th century America.
Absolutely. And don't forget Abraham had slaves as well.
Sure.
This was the way of the world in those days, and for millennia, peoples have had slaves, of people have been oppressed, and yes, you're absolutely right. But we tend to sort of think of those slaves as different in some way to the African American slaves.
Right.
And that's a shame, really, because we have to just think of the brutality of the ancient world. That it wasn't a pleasant place to live. You would often not survive beyond your 30s if you were lucky. And it's remarkable that some of the patriarchs did live to such ages as they did. But you've got a world where it was actually very bloody and very dangerous to be, and you wouldn't have a long expectancy of life, and you might end up as a slave. It's as simple as that. And Hagar, the Egyptian concubine of Abraham, she was an Egyptian slave of Abraham's. Mm-hmm. You would think of it the other way around, wouldn't you? Because we have the slaves in Egypt in the time of Moses. But actually, before that, Abraham had his own concubines and servants, and they were chattel servants. They weren't paid salaries, and they couldn't just leave. Hagar had to run away. So they were chattel servants, and therefore they were effectively what we would call slaves today.
Mm-hmm. One final question, and I know we've only scratched the surface of a topic that we could continue for hours, but in the interest of keeping this to a manageable length for people listening during a commute or some such, I try to keep these to under an hour if I can.
Right.
But I have to ask this because I'm really curious. You've devoted decades to your study, and many of your books deal with the historicity of the biblical account. How has your work affected your faith?
That's a question I get asked so often.
I'm not surprised.
It's such a difficult one to answer because, as you probably know from my books, I claim to be an agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know what that means. They think it's an atheist, but I'm not an atheist by any stretch of the imagination. Agnostic simply means not knowing. Okay, and I just don't know yet. I can be a historian and I can look at the reality of the Bible stories and the events in the Bible, and I can say these happened. These really did happen. But an archaeologist and a historian cannot find evidence for miracles, the supernatural, in archaeology. We will never find evidence, I don't think, for a parting of the Red Sea or Reed Sea. We will find the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, but we won't find evidence necessarily of all 10 plagues. You can never do that. Just because there's plagues of frogs and locusts, they're not going to be found in archaeology. So although I think the biblical stories, the narratives, are based on real, genuine history and people, I cannot, in all honesty, say that I can find evidence for the miraculous elements in the Bible. Although you have to say that it's a remarkable story. If without intervention, sounds almost impossible without divine intervention. Many
other people groups have come and gone from world history in the time, and the Jews are still here with us. The Israelites are still here with us. I asked that same question to a gentleman named Barry Schwartz, who has spent decades researching the Shroud of Turin. And Barry was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, fell away, got into the New Age movement back in the 60s and 70s, and through his work as part of the research team on the Shroud of Turin, has come to believe that it is, in fact, a genuine artifact that does, in fact, match the stories told about it. And he believes
I absolutely agree.
And I asked him the question, so if you believe that this shroud actually wrapped Jesus and that the image imprinted on it was a result of his resurrection, and he finished the question for me, why am I still a Jew? I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, he didn't want to get too personal, but he said, just bear this in mind. I'm not dead yet. So,
I think that's the road we're all on. Okay. I think I quite often hear this by evangelical people say, God comes to you. Okay, you don't necessarily search him out. All right, and in a sense, some of us are still on the road. We're still on the road, and maybe it's a little bit smug of evangelical Christians to think that everything is tied up for them, everything's neat and tidy. Mm-hmm. They've got their faith, everything's perfect. But actually, faith is not just about blind faith; it's about reason as well.
Absolutely,
it's about proof. The biblical story is the evidence. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Bible is your evidence, right? And therefore you have to test it. Like with any good scientist or historian do, you test it and you find out if it matches with the archaeology and with the historical evidence. And that's what I find it does. So if it helps people of faith that my work encourages and reinforces that faith with reason, with logic and with evidence, then I'm very happy about that. I'm delighted that that's the case. But I'm not happy about people who say we don't need that evidence. It doesn't matter whether we don't find any evidence for it because I've just got my faith and that's all I need. Mm-hmm. You need to have, as Paul and Jesus both said, you have to see to believe. Okay, and if you have to see the people of Israel in the historical setting, in the Holy Land, in Egypt, and wherever else they went, in Babylon or wherever it is, because that is the proof of the reality of the Bible.
And your work is a help in especially, I think, for young people who are going into higher education or being exposed to higher education in their collegiate lives, even in high school, and hearing from over and over from authority figures, teachers, professors, that there is no such evidence. And again, that's what led me to your work, as I was teaching a Sunday school course to junior and senior high school students, and was looking for evidence that the Exodus was historical. And again, found your work to be extremely helpful in that regard. And I think, there will never be, because we cannot say, for example, with 100% certainty that the statue, the 8-foot tall statue that was discovered by the Austrian team, is in fact the statue of Joseph. The evidence suggests that it is, but we can't. There's no way we can know with 100% certainty, because there's no.
And that is the game that historians play, because historians actually work on the preponderance of evidence. They can never come up with absolute facts, or rather, they do have facts, but when it comes to it, it's still only a theory. It's still only a thesis. All history is a theory.
Yes,
it's the past is what happened. What we're doing is our best guess at what happened.
Yeah,
and it's the best form of history that ended up being accepted by the people, and that's what we've got here. And if anything, I would like to help those young Christians who go off to university, to secular universities or wherever, and are told that the whole thing is a fairy story. I'd like to help them to come back to the faith by giving them the evidence, which gives them the courage and the strength to agree with their elders, with their parents, etc., that the biblical story is based on real history.
Yeah, and that evidence, leads us to a certain point, but at some point, that's where faith has to take in. But again, it is a faith based on evidence and not just on blind faith.
Absolutely.
Again, that's why I truly appreciate your work, and this conversation has been a real joy for me and a blessing. David, your most recent book, again, Exodus, Myth or History, where would people find a copy of that?
It's not published as in all the bookshops, but you can get it out from the Patterns of Evidence web store in the States, so you can get it from there, or you can get it from Amazon.com in the States. If you're further afield in the wider world, in the UK, for instance, you would get it from Amazon.co.uk, or you can order it from either of those two sources for anywhere else in the world. And unfortunately, because it's a big, heavy book, the shipping costs are quite expensive, but it's not being published and sent out to the bookshops. It's a limited edition, if you like. But once we've got through our first batch of stock, we can then go for a reprint. And hopefully people will be able to get it the normal ways, as I say, through the Amazon stores or through the Patterns of Evidence store, which is where you can also get the lecture series that you mentioned earlier on as well, from the Patterns of Evidence web store. Well,
I'll put links to those in the show notes, vftb.net, and I can vouch for the presentations being really engaging and fascinating. Again, a real pleasure talking with you, David. I hope we can do it again.
I would love to. That was great fun. Thank you very much.
David Rohl, as we mentioned, one of the featured witnesses in Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, the excellent film by Timothy Mahoney, who's been a guest here on this program several times. We'll put a link to that, put a link to David's book, Exodus, Myth or History, in the show notes, which you'll find at vftb.net, Spreaker.com, or anywhere else that posts the show notes. So you can follow these and hopefully take advantage of the research that they've been doing for yourselves. Coming up, we're going to talk about the location of the biblical Sodom. That, too, is historical. And a team from Trinity Southwest University in New Mexico believes that they found it, and they've got really good scientific evidence to back up their claim. Dr. Phillip Sylvia joins us next on this Best of View from the Bunker episode. Straight ahead.
The victims of the human trafficking and sex trade industry have reached a boiling point around the world. But here in the United States, the demand has never been higher. Tragically, the massive growth of these unconscionable underground organizations is due in part to many citizens' disbelief that our modern society is capable of such atrocities. and live in a denial that these crimes are taking place here on our soil each and every day. Skywatch TV and Whispering Ponies Ranch remain committed to providing ministry to the hurting, to the victims of abuses just like this and so much more. This is why we're proud to announce our new partnership with Yaku Buyans and 8 Days Ministry. In an effort to educate on these important topics and provide you with the tools needed to get engaged in the fight against sex trafficking, we present the 8 Days Special Collection. In this timely collection, you'll receive the cinematic movie inspired by actual events from director Yaku Buyans' 8 Days. This shocking presentation masterfully illustrates sequence by sequence how the victims of sex trafficking are often lured into entrapment, portrayed through the eyes of the lead characters. This incredible collection also includes the phenomenal book and companion workbook on disc, Woman of Influence, written by 8 Days screenwriter Phillip Buyans and lead actress Katie Walker. This 30-day devotional and companion workbook on disc is an inspiring, deeply affirming, and educational set that will encourage women to walk in the true identity of influence and purpose bestowed on them as daughters of the Most High God. But that's not all. You'll also receive on DVD the never-before-released, uncensored, off-the-record interview with the team behind the 8 Days movie, featuring Yaku and Phillippa Buyans and actress Katie Walker as they disclose the hard-hitting realities of just how far the sex trafficking industry reaches, what the Trump administration has done to rescue thousands of victims, how the children of communities, including yours, may be at risk, and what you can do to fight back. Sold separately, this invaluable collection holds a retail value of $90. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. Sex trafficking is a difficult conversation, but ignoring it doesn't make it go away or help its victims. Understand this epidemic and learn how you can help by ordering the 8 Days Special Collection. Online now at the Skywatch TV store or call 1-844-750-4985.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Talking the walk each and every Sunday night live from the Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. 7 p.m. Sundays. That's Central Time, UTC minus 5 during the summer, Daylight Savings, you know. I'm Derek Gilbert. One of the things that I really enjoy is, academic research. I would never have guessed this during my time in college because I really didn't study the way I should have back then when I had access to college libraries. But thankfully, the internet is kind of making up for that lack of attention then, and helping draw me into some really fascinating research now, which has led to, several books so far with a couple more on the... In fact, I've got a whiteboard in front of me here with 8 book projects on it lined up from now till 2022, God willing. Anyway, one of the real joys of the last year has been able to talk to this gentleman, our next guest, who is part of a team from Trinity Southwest University in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They've been digging in the vicinity of the Dead Sea, in fact, very close to Mount Nebo. In fact, as you listen to this, we are very close to having seen or having just seen Mount Nebo and this particular dig site from the summit there. Why is that significant? You'll find out in this discussion as we talk about the science of finding Sodom with Dr. Phillip Sylvia. It's not often that scientific papers delivered to a group of academics, especially specialists in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, will make a splash in mainstream media. But that is exactly what happened with our guest this week. He delivered a paper to the American Schools of Oriental Research in November, and one journalist was present. His story was picked up on and expanded by the mainstream media into perhaps more than what was delivered, but we'll find out more about that. Our guest is a field archaeologist. He's the supervisor and director of scientific analysis for the Tal el-Hammam Excavation Project, which is a site in Jordan very near the Dead Sea. He represents Trinity Southwest University in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We are honored to welcome Dr. Phillip Sylvia to the program. Phil, thank you for taking time out of your schedule today.
My pleasure, Derek. Glad we could get together for this.
So, Tal el-Hammam, what is it, where is it, and why is this a significant dig site?
Okay, Tal el-Hammam is in the Great Rift Valley. So it's in that circular plain immediately north of the Dead Sea. We are about 14 kilometers northeast, or about 6.5 miles northeast of the Dead Sea. So we're right up against the eastern edge of the, I guess you could call it the cliffside, which is the valley wall that takes you up to the Jordan Plateau. It's a significant site because it is by far the largest site in the southern Levant. At its peak during the Middle Bronze Age, there was only one other site comparable in size, and that would be Hatzor, that's up further north, closer to the Sea of Galilee. So it was a very dominant Middle Bronze Age urban center.
Okay, so Middle Bronze Age, for people not familiar with that time scale, when would that be BC?
Okay, well, as far as we are concerned, the terminal event that destroyed the site happened in 1700 BC.
Okay.
In terms of the biblical timeline, we are right in the wheelhouse of the time frame of the whole Abraham and Lot narrative. So we're in the patriarchal period as Abraham is coming into the land with his nephew Lot.
Okay, so there's an event that destroyed this site around the time of Abraham and Lot.
Correct.
Okay. All right. People's ears are already beginning to pick up. But this was a big site. Now, Hazor was considered the capital when the Israelites came back some 300 years later, 200 and some odd years later. The largest city in northern Canaan. So this site, Tal el-Hammam, was comparable to Hazor in later days.
Actually, at the time of the destruction event, they were almost identical in size. After Tal el-Hammam went offline in 1700 BC, Hatzor continued to grow and grew substantially. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a capital per se, because the Canaanites were not an organized nation. They were a loose confederation of urban centers. But it certainly was the dominant urban center of the region of Canaan, yes.
Okay. So this was an important city, probably connected to trade. If it was it on the King's Highway then? Would it have been connected to trade from, say, Arabia or Egypt and the rest of Mesopotamia?
Oh, absolutely. Tal el-Hammam was one of the main crossroads. If you can picture the Dead Sea in your mind and picture a circular plain at the north end of the Dead Sea, on the west you have Jericho. And it was at the crossroads of the main north-south trade route that went up the west side of the Jordan River. And Tal el-Hammam is on the main trade route that went up the east side of the Jordan River. There was a connecting path, road, trail, whatever you want to call it, between Tal el-Hammam and Jordan. So these two cities controlled all of the commerce that traveled the King's Highway up the east side or on the west side up through the western bank of the Jordan River. Jericho, however, was much, much smaller. Tal el-Hammam, in the meantime, was a 600-pound gorilla sitting in the middle of the valley. It's a very large site, measuring almost 1,000 meters long and 600 meters wide, encompassing about 64 acres within the perimeter of the fortification walls that went around the city. And when you add all of the villages and towns and the agricultural fields, we're well over 100 acres. So it's a very large site.
Any estimate as to how many people would have lived there?
We're estimating that within the urban footprint of Tal el-Hammam that there was perhaps as many as 45,000. You might stretch it up to 60,000, but I think that's a stretch. So we're talking a substantial urban center of about 45,000 people in 1700 BC.
That's more people than live in our county here in southwest Missouri. So what was it that attracted your attention, that drew you to Trinity Southwest University and the project there at Tal el-Hammam?
Well, what drew me to the school was actually my wife putting a foot in my back as I was approaching retirement age and suggested that I go do something with all of the independent research that I've been doing for about 40 years. And what I had been researching primarily is what I call catastrophic language in the Old Testament, which basically deals with the writers of the Old Testament who did not have the scientific understanding that we have today, did not have the vocabulary that we have today, still were experiencing things in real life, and they wanted to write those experiences down. And because they didn't have the vocabulary to do it, they used a lot of similes. So I'll give you a very quick example. So David writes about hills skipping like gazelles and mountains melting like wax. And so my question is, what does that mean? And I'll give you the short form of the story. Basically, it means he's talking about major earthquake activity, hills skipping like gazelles, and he's talking about massive landslides, mountains melting like wax. That's what it appeared like to him. But he didn't understand plate tectonics. He didn't have the vocabulary to talk about that. So he uses similes that he can convey to his readers what it is he's seeing. And that's catastrophic language in the Old Testament.
And this has been something that you found intriguing for quite some time.
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, I've been studying it for about 40 years. As I was approaching retirement age, and my wife said, go do something with it. So she encouraged me to go get a doctorate. That led me to Trinity Southwest University. And originally I was wanting to do a Doctor of Theology, a THD. And I told Dr. Collins when I met him, he's the dean of the school, the executive dean, or was at the time. And I told him I wanted to do a study on catastrophic language in the Old Testament and how catastrophism helped shape the theological development of ancient Israel. And he said, fine, set the second part aside for your second book. Focus on the first part and use Tal el-Hammam as your example, because he thought Tal el-Hammam was Sodom. And, of course, the Sodom narrative is one of those catastrophic events. So I'm already on that page, and that's how I got involved. Didn't know until I got to Tal el-Hammam for the first time in 2012 that, wow, this is where I need to be.
Now, what was it that you discovered at Tal el-Hammam that you found so fascinating then?
Well, initially what I found was the alignment of stacked foundations in the sacred precinct of the site. Because that was something that I had read about, studied about, mostly from Egypt. This is the first time I'm actually seeing it in the ground, so that caught my attention. But as time went on, and as we started to collect the physical evidence from the site, we started encountering objects that defied explanation from normal human activity. Things such as what we describe as vitrified pottery, or pottery that the surface has been melted to glass. When that piece was first found, we said, what is vitrified pottery doing in a sealed Middle Bronze Age context? Because glazed pottery did not get introduced into the area until about 600 AD. Okay. And we're in a context that dates to 1700 BC. And so we're looking. Dr. Collins, who found that piece, is looking at this piece and tried to figure out what it was. So he sent it off to New Mexico Tech, down in Socorro, New Mexico, and they examined it under their scanning electron microscope and discovered that we had a 5 millimeter thick, about quarter-inch thick, but I'm going to speak millimeters for a moment because it's easy to describe this, 5 millimeter thick piece of pottery. The top or outer 1 millimeter was melted glass. The next 2 millimeters down were thermally darkened, and then the bottom 2 millimeters were the normal color. We're trying to figure out, how did that happen? Because that was beyond the capability of people in 1700 BC. That wasn't a capability to do that. So that's when they started to understand that we have a thermal profile here that cannot be explained through human activity that created this particular broken piece of pottery. And so that just raises all kinds of questions. We looked at the ground and we noticed particularly our tell is what we call bi-level. It's got an upper tell, the Acropolis, and then it's got a lower tell. And there's about 100 feet difference in elevation. So the lower tell about 100 feet higher than the surrounding plain. The upper tell is another 100 feet higher than that. On the lower tell, we'd be digging in the dirt. It'd be normal brown dirt during the day. We'd go home at night. We'd come back in the morning, and there'd be a white haze over the ground. And try to figure out, what is that coming from? And so that led to some soil analysis to figure out what's going on. It turned out to be the lower tell is saturated with basically salts from the Dead Sea, from Dead Sea water. there's only 3 other sites on our side of the river that have been excavated, and all 3 of those other sites have the exact same occupational profile as our site. They were all founded back in the early Chalcolithic, late Neolithic period, so about 4500 BC. They've been continuously occupied right up through and including the Middle Bronze Age, and then every single site in the area went offline at the same time. They were all destroyed, all in the same way, and it was not by conquest. So that raises a question. How did that happen? How did our site get saturated with Dead Sea water? What kind of thermal profile was needed in order to melt the outer surface of this piece of pottery? We found other pieces since then. So all of these questions started to come together to say, okay, we need to understand what was the event that occurred here to create all of this physical evidence that we're looking at. And what prevented people from living here for the next 600 years after that destruction event.
So the destruction was so complete that this area north of the Dead Sea was basically wiped out, just depopulated for centuries.
Yes, 6 to 7 centuries, exactly.
Wow.
Especially on the east side. Now, Jericho came back small, but Jericho came back after a few hundred years, and so it recreated itself just in time for Joshua to take it out later in the late Bronze Age.
Right.
But the east side, where we were, urban centers did not get reestablished there until the early Iron Age. So the time of Solomon, basically, is when people started moving back there. And what we've discovered on our site, coincidentally, and by the way, let me just say that we're not setting out to prove the Bible because we believe the Bible is true. But on the other hand, everything that we're finding is so consistent with the biblical text, it's just astounding. What we found at our site is during the Iron Age, people came back, and our site apparently became one of those unnamed store cities during the period of Solomon and later. There are actually 4 kings in the Old Testament, starting with Solomon, who are credited with having built store cities in the land. And ours apparently was one of them, because we found that during the Iron Age 2 specifically, they started drilling what we call silos. When we talk about silos, we think of a structure that's standing up above the ground. A silo in this period was a hole dug in the ground, and they lined it with stones and sometimes plastered it, and that's where they would store their grain underground.
Right.
In these cylindrical pits called silos. We've already identified over 24 silos that were dug into the upper tell, right through the rampart wall, in some cases right through the foundation walls and lined with stones. And they were all done during the Iron Age. And a couple of years ago, we discovered an Iron Age warehouse on the upper tell where they would store the processed grain. And so our site came back online, and the other sites around us came back online during the early Iron Age. Well, this is about 600 to 700 years after the destruction event. So what happened that prevented people from living there for almost 7 centuries? And these are the kinds of questions that are going through our mind as we are discovering more and more material that is just uncharacteristic coming out of the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer. Uncharacteristic for human activity during that period.
Now, the reporter for Science News, Bruce Bauer, in his report, didn't, I'll put a link to this in the show notes, by the way, so that listeners can view this article themselves and then compare it against the mainstream news sites and how they interpreted what Mr. Bauer wrote. Did not mention Sodom by name. He stuck to, now, was that because you didn't mention Sodom during your presentation at the ASOR meeting?
That is correct. I purposefully did not talk about Sodom. I talked about our site, Tal el-Hammam, and I talked about the physical evidence that we're finding. You have to understand that for the archaeological community to consider a destruction event involving a meteoritic airburst, that is like new turf for archaeologists. They spend their time looking down into the ground. They don't spend their time looking up into the sky. And so I was trying to present for the first time publicly the preliminary conclusions that we are drawing from our investigation and from our analysis of the materials we're recovering, and to build a case for the possibility that not only our site, but the entire region was destroyed by a meteoritic airburst event. Well, that's kind of mind-blowing for archaeologists who never look up, they're always looking down. And I did not want to encumber that story with throwing a biblical spin on it by saying, and oh, by the way, this was Sodom. Because half of the archaeologists, well, more than half the archaeologists of the world, first of all, they're not necessarily Bible-believing people, and most of them think that especially the Pentateuch and maybe even the first 7 books, up and including 1 Samuel, are all based on myth and legend.
Right.
And in fact, what's really sad is that there's been over 24 articles that have been spawned since the original article that appeared in Science News. And you can see the attitude of some of the writers when they say, well, we finally have a physical explanation for the myth of Sodom or the legend of Sodom. So, yeah, I didn't want to go there, so I purposefully did not talk about Sodom.
Mm-hmm.
And I stuck to the science.
Well, and he did mention the Tunguska event from 1908, which I thought was really interesting because that has baffled scientists, but also conspiracy theorists for years. It's another one of those, well, we don't know what it was, so it must have been aliens sort of events.
Yeah.
So how do you then research this? I mean, what do you look for? I mean, you mentioned the vitrified pottery, but then how do you go about trying to confirm a theory like this? I mean, it's not like this is something you can replicate in a laboratory. Let's explode a meteorite over the lab and see what happens. What would you look for?
Well, there's several things, but I do believe we are dealing with a Tunguska class event, and at least so far, this is the only known Tunguska-class meteoritic airburst event that occurred over a populated urban area, which is significant. Now, what you start looking for is when you start I've mentioned several of the dots already. Let me connect some of those dots for you. Okay, first of all, we have a highly destructive event. How do we know that? We know that because of the physical condition of the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer on the site. If you can picture, probably for Americans, you think of an adobe building, a mud brick building. Well, during this period of time, in that location, they would build mud brick structures on fieldstone foundations. And so the fieldstone foundations would be set into the ground, and then they would erect their mud brick superstructures on top of it, and that was their housing. Very much like the Native American pueblos that we have here in New Mexico. If you want to see what one looks like, come to New Mexico and go visit some of our pueblos, and you can see what an adobe building looks like. And that's what they had. Well, there are no standing structures left anywhere on the lower tell. All we have left is foundations from the Middle Bronze Age. We have a couple of structures that were built in the Iron Age, but basically the entire lower tell was completely blown off of its foundations by this event. And what's significant is we know it was not an earthquake because we can see evidence of earthquake damage in the earlier material from the early Bronze Age and earlier. We can see evidence in foundations where there was earthquake event and repairs made. But from the Middle Bronze Age, when you have an earthquake, the ground is moving back and forth, and so walls fall down in both directions, in all directions. But our event in the Middle Bronze Age, everything fell down in one direction.
Okay.
Which means, okay, we're talking about potentially here a blast front, a unidirectional surge of energy, concussive force that was enough to knock the mud brick superstructures of the mostly residential lower tell off of their foundations and reduce them to just rubble and dust. We have very, very few sections of wall fallen in place. Very few and very small. Now, on the upper tell, we have these massive mud brick rampart walls that go up the sides of the upper tell at a very steep angle. And you also have the Acropolis up there. So you had the King's Palace up there with very thick mud walls. The palace walls are 1.2 meters thick. So they were almost 4 feet thick, really massive mud brick walls. But yet everything that was above what we would project as the height of the rampart walls was sheared off.
Wow.
So based on the thickness of the palace walls, we were assuming we're looking at a 3 to 4 story mud brick structure. All we have left sitting on stone foundation up there of these 4-foot thick walls are maybe 5 to 7 courses of brick. Everything else is sheared off. Wow. So anything that projected above the rampart walls was also torn off on the upper tell. So there was a massive concussive force that hit the area. That's point one. Now we have to deal with, the vitrified pottery, and not just the one piece, but several pieces that we found now. How do you explain that? We're talking about a pretty extreme thermal profile, and we're starting to get a feel for it. So, and I want to be a little careful throwing around numbers here, but when we examined the melted glass surface on that piece of pottery, what we found, and we're examining it under the scanning electron microscope, what we found is that embedded within the glass are melted zircons, which is basically a zinc-based mineral. The melting temperature of the zircon is close to 2,000 degrees, 2,000 to 2,200 degrees, in that range. But when we looked at it even more carefully, I mentioned earlier that we first looked at it on the scanning electron microscopes at New Mexico Tech. Well, we have another team looking at it now in North Carolina with a more powerful scanning electron microscope. And when they looked at the same melted zircon, what they found is they call them vesicles in the melted crystal. And what that means is it's filled with tiny little holes. And those little tiny holes are created by the actual melted crystal beginning to boil and to go from the solid to the liquid to the gas state. Wow. And so this actually began to boil the crystal. So now we're talking about temperatures that are closer to 4,000 degrees. So it raises the question in your mind, all right, you've got a 5 millimeter thick piece of material that the outer 1 millimeter was melted to glass, where at least momentarily that surface got up to 4,000 degrees to not only melt but actually boil the zircon. But yet the whole piece didn't melt down.
That was my question. Then how is it possible that only that outer millimeter and not the whole piece all the way through? I mean, was it just happened so quickly that the inside surface didn't have enough time to get that hot?
Well, you've got two factors going on. One is you have to have an extremely high thermal profile to get it that hot, right. But it had to be an extremely short duration so that only the outer surface was affected and the whole thing didn't melt down. So what are those two numbers? We don't know yet. We just, as a result, one of the nice things about all of these articles is I had a fellow who I'm going to leave unnamed for now until he's ready to have his involvement be made public. But at any rate, I had a material scientist reach out to me who has the capability of, he thinks, of actually replicating that. Oh. And so now we're looking forward to maybe getting some temperature and time profiles that would be required to produce this. But let's go back to an airburst event. All right. Mm-hmm. Now we're starting to collect some of these dots. All right. Very concussive event, very high thermal profile. I mentioned Chelyabinsk earlier in February of 2013. That was estimated at 500 kiloton or 500,000 pound TNT equivalent explosion in the air at an altitude of 12 kilometers. And thankfully, because it was over an urban center, it was high enough and small enough that the only damage they experienced, I say that lightly here, tongue-in-cheek, they had the windows blown out of 6,000 buildings the roof of a zinc factory collapsed. Nobody was killed.
Mm-hmm.
About 1,600 people sought medical attention. Only 120 were actually hospitalized. Nobody died from it. The symptoms that they were looking at were basically the equivalent of flash burns, were like a sunburn effect. Mm-hmm. Temporary blindness, flash blindness again, temporary deafness from the basically the sonic boom and the concussive sound of the blast. So that was 500 kilotons, 12 kilometers up. Had it been lower, there would have been a lot of dead people. And most of the people went because they suffered cuts from the glass that was blown out of the windows.
Okay. Well,
okay,
yeah,
so,
makes sense.
Right. Now go back to September of 1908. That's when the Tunguska event happened. That event happened over relatively sparse inhabited northern Siberia, over a pine forest. That airburst is estimated between 20 and 30 megatons, million tons of TNT at a burst altitude of 10 kilometers. It flattened an area of forest that footprint would entirely encompass the modern city of Rome. If that had happened over Rome, there would be no Rome.
Yeah.
But thankfully, it happened over a forest. And it blew the trees down. The trees that were immediately at ground zero underneath this event, still standing trunks, but the branches stripped right off of it. Flash burns on the bark. Branches stripped off of the other trees, and the other trees were laid radially outward from the epicenter. Just a massive event. So we think we're in that class now. So we've got a big thermal profile, highly concussive event. Now we have to explain. So that explains for me the directionality of the fact that all of our walls were blown off in one direction. It explains for me the reason why it was not just our site, but the area, the whole region that got blown down. And we're talking about a footprint that's roughly 500 square miles. Let me think. It's 25 kilometers. So what's pi r squared? Radius is 13. You can figure it out from there. A 13-kilometer radius is the size of the circular plane that got wiped out in this area. So that's the footprint. Whereas the Tunguska event was 2,200 square kilometers. So we're a smaller footprint than Tunguska, but yet equally as intense. Then we have to explain so we have a directionality, and just as an by the way, all of the walls were blown in the northeast direction.
Huh.
Okay? So hold that thought in mind. The next thing is how do we explain the fact that the lower tail seems to have been saturated with water from the Dead Sea when we've never been underwater, and especially not at the intensity of the chemical composition of the water of the Dead Sea now.
How far from the Dead Sea is the Tal?
14 kilometers from the northeast corner.
Okay.
About 6 miles.
All right.
So now that, and just as another, by the way, the northeast end of the Dead Sea is southwest of our site. So we've got the walls being pushed in the northeast direction. We've got water being pushed in the northeast direction. Now, Mark Boslow at Sandia National Labs, he's well known for the computer modeling that he's been doing of meteoritic impact and airburst events. He put out a hypothesis in 2014 that an airburst event over a body of water would not only push would basically create a tsunami event that would push the water out and create a tsunami outward from it. So that could explain if the airburst was over the north end of the Dead Sea, if that was ground zero, that would explain the directionality of the concussive force. It would explain pushing a tsunami, miniature one, of course, because there's not that much water available, but it would push a tsunami of Dead Sea water up across the landscape, across the very flat wide open plain, deep enough to inundate the lower tell, but not deep enough to make it all the way to the top of the upper tell.
Huh.
So that could explain why the lower tell is saturated with the salts and sulfates that are identical to what's in the water of the Dead Sea. So the next dot we then connect. So we've got a directionality associated with a highly concussive extreme thermal profile event. And the only naturally occurring physical phenomena that can produce that are either a meteoritic impact or airburst event. Either of those could do it. Mm-hmm. There is, however, no crater in our area. The closest crater is 150 kilometers away, and it's southeast of our location, so that couldn't be the source. And the timing of that crater we don't know yet. It's much older than our event. But at any rate, that's why we lean towards an airburst event. We believe it was an airburst event because of the thermal profile, because of the concussive profile, because of the tsunami effect, because of the directionality that we're seeing, because of the amount of area that was taken out by this event. And it was, a very focused event, which an airburst tends to be, because you've got a momentum to the mass. You've got all of that. When the explosion occurs, that mass is converted to plasma. So, it's a very focused event that could very easily be limited to just the valley floor, because there is no evidence of any interruption of occupation on either the Judean plateau to our west or the Jordanian plateau to the east. So it was totally contained within the valley, within that circular plain. Now, the other thing that's explained, this concussive event not only blew the buildings off their foundations, but it also destroyed the topsoil, and then the tsunami from the Dead Sea then saturated the remaining subsoil with salts.
Which made it essentially poisonous to plants.
Exactly.
Toxic, yeah.
Exactly. So when we did the chemical analysis of the soil, what we discovered that in the ash layer of that Middle Bronze Age destruction event, we have 6% salts and sulfates from the Dead Sea.
Wow.
Now, why is that significant? I'll tell you why. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if the level of salt contamination in the soil exceeds 1.3%, wheat will not germinate.
Huh.
If it exceeds 1.6%, barley will not germinate. Those are your two top cereal grains. If you can't grow cereal grains, you can't feed people, you can't feed cattle, you're not going to live there. Mm-hmm. We're at 6% in that destruction layer.
This area would have been, without that salt in the soil, would have been prime real estate back in the day, wouldn't it? Absolutely.
This is all bottom ground, and for anybody out there who's a farmer, it's the bottom ground. In the valleys, that's where the good soil is.
Right.
And yes, this was a prime agricultural area. It is actually the best watered agriscape in the entire Levant down there. And so, all of that land, however, was taken offline for agricultural purposes because of the salt contamination. And it took 6 centuries to 7 centuries for that salt to be flushed out through. And again, we're in a very arid area, so annual rainfall is quite low. It took that long for the soil to recover. And when there was flooding, where we'd get enough new silt laid down from the heavy annual rains, it took that long to bury and encapsulate that contaminated soil. Wow. and rinse out what was left so that they could start growing cereal grain crops again. And they started growing it to about 5 kilometers to the north about 600 years later, and it took almost another century till they could actually start growing crops again in the immediate vicinity of Tal el-Hammam. But once they started growing it again, and it's again mostly barley, because there was still a relatively high salt contamination, they started growing it abundantly, so much so that they had to dig all of these silos, and they were storing massive amounts of grain from the field, and a very large warehouse they built on our upper tell in order to store the processed grain as a distribution center. And because of that, they put a small garrison. But this is all 700 years later.
Okay, and that would be around the time of the rise of the David and Solomon, the Solomonic Davidic kingdom.
Yeah, it would have been during the period of Solomon, certainly, and then later. And then our site was taken offline again, again around the time of the Assyrian and later Babylonian invasion, and our site was never reoccupied after that.
Right.
At least not as an urban center.
This is fascinating stuff, and again, it's interesting that the author of the piece in Science News, just contained himself to calling this the settlements north of the Dead Sea instead of connecting it to Sodom. It was other authors, other writers, CBN News, Breaking Israel News, and sites like that instantly made the connection. And yes. I mean, anyone who's familiar with biblical history would you see timeline 1700 BC, north of the Dead Sea. And make that connection.
Exactly.
Coming back to the dig site itself, what is it about the site that convinced Dr. Collins, and I've got a copy of his book here, Discovering the City of Sodom, and convinces you that he was correct in identifying this as the biblical Sodom?
Well, what got his attention, first of all, is Genesis chapter 13. Now, Dr. Collins was a very active archaeologist in Israel, and he was working at the site that has been identified as Ai. And if you remember the Abrahamic narrative, when he and Lot first come down from Mesopotamia, they come down into Canaan, and they stop at Bethel and Ai. And he makes a little altar to the Lord there. And but there was famine in the land, so they continue on down into Egypt. This is all in chapter 13 of Genesis. Mm-hmm. All right, so they spend some amount of time down in Egypt, and their livestock is multiplied. They come out of Egypt, very wealthy men, and they wander back up north through the Negev, and they end up back at Bethel and Ai. And then we have that famous narrative about the arguments that break out between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen, and they decide they need to part company because although the famine is mitigating somewhat, there's not enough water, there's not enough grazing area for their flocks, so they need to split up. So standing between Bethel and Ai, we have this discussion that takes place between Abraham and Lot, and basically Abraham makes the offer, if you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you want to go to the right, I'll go to the left. Mm-hmm. And now, they don't have words in Hebrew for the cardinal directions, northeast, southwest. So although most of our modern ones, if you want to go north, I'll go south, that's a modern translation.
Right.
It's basically left, right, and then it says, and Lot looked up. Now, understand that when you talk about to the left and looking up, you're facing east. Mm-hmm. Their reference is east, not north like we do. It's east. And so left would be north. Right would be south, and it says he looks up. In other words, he looks east, and that's when he looks across the valley from Bethel and Ai, and he sees that it's a very well-watered landscape. In fact, he describes it like the Garden of God. Mm-hmm. How is the Garden of God watered? Right? With streams, with springs, with a river running through it, and then he says, like the Nile. Because it just came out of Egypt. Well, how is the Nile watered? It's watered by the annual flooding of Egypt is watered by the annual flooding of the Nile River. They practice dry farming there, so that as the waters recede, they're planting their crops, and then they dry farm and harvest with the fall rains. Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what happens in the bottom of the Jordan. Well, it used to happen in the bottom of the Jordan Valley. You've got the Nile in miniature with the Jordan River. The same phenomenon would take place, where the Jordan River would flood and come out of its banks and go about halfway across the valley floor. That's why there are no urban centers in the middle of the valley floor. They're all up by the foothills on the edges. Mm-hmm. And then they would dry farm. And so it looks like the Nile in miniature. It looks like the Garden of God, which is Eden, and how Eden was watered. And so you've got the best watered agriscape in the entire Levant. And he decides that he's going to go east. So it says he packs up and he heads east towards Sodom, and he set up his camps around Sodom. So we know it's east of Bethel and Ai, and that's what caught Dr. Collins' attention, because he used to subscribe prior to that that kind of encounter with the scriptures again to what we refer to euphemistically as the Southern Sodom theory. Everybody has tried to put Sodom south of the Dead Sea, and that's because of a couple of really unfortunate word choices in the King James translation that led people looking for the wrong stuff in the wrong place. But that's another story for later. But at any rate, the scripture very clearly gives us the geographical clues to know where to go looking. It's just nobody bothered looking at the scripture, and nobody bothered looking where the scripture said to go. And so that's what attracted Dr. Collins' attention. And so he and a couple of two other couples that were close friends of his set about to do a walking survey of the floor. So they went over to Jordan, they went over to Acor, they studied all the reports, got the survey reports, had a top 12 list of a list of the top 12 candidate sites. And then they went and actually walked the ground. And like I said, the 600-pound gorilla staring in your face is that very large Tal el-Hammam. And just based on its size, that if that was Sodom, how was Sodom portrayed in Scripture?
Well, it was important enough that the kings from the east, the king of Elam, the king of Babylon in the day, and their allies marched all the way over from what is now southeastern Iraq and northwestern Iran to the Dead Sea in order to wage war against this city.
Exactly right. And it's portrayed as the controlling urban center of a city-state complex. That's how it's portrayed. And so you would expect it to be the largest urban center in the area. And by golly, it is. The next closest one is Tel Nebreen, which we believe could be a good candidate for Adma, is only 1/4 the size. So, and again, like I said before, Tal el-Hammam, the only other site comparable in size at that time was Hatzor. Some say Hazor. I say Hatzor.
Hatzor.
But anyway, Anyway, so it's a big urban center and it's got all of the markings. When we look at Tal el-Hammam, it's got all of the markings of a controlling urban center of a city-state complex. It's got its guardian cities encircling us with Tel Nimreen, Tel Rama, Tel Iktanu, Tel Kafrain. It's got all of the markings of a large urban center. And that is how Sodom is portrayed in the scripture. So that's what caught his attention. So based on the geographical clues coming out of the scripture, which, by the way, we have more geographical clues for the location of Sodom than we do for Jerusalem.
And I might also add more than the Quran has for Mecca, but that's another story as well.
That's a whole other story too. I mean, they're there if it only you pay attention to the book and treat it as good geography as well as good history and not just myth and legend. So anyway, I digress. So right away he began to understand that Tal el-Hammam was the right place based on the geographical clues. Now, 13 years, we're about to begin our 14th season of excavation at Tal el-Hammam. So 13 years later, not only is it the right place, but we're finding it's the right time. Sodom is first introduced in Genesis chapter 10. The context of Genesis chapter 10 is early Bronze Age, about 2500 BC. And it's named as one of the border cities of the region of Canaan. So for it to be named as a border city, it has to be a fortified city. In the early Bronze Age, early Bronze 2 is when they started building fortified cities.
Right.
And guess what? We have a fortified city going back to the early Bronze Age. I mentioned earlier that it was first settled in the early Chalcolithic, maybe late Neolithic period, so about 4500 BC. By the time you get to the early Bronze Age, we've got a fortified city. And so it has to exist as a fortified city, and our site does. It has to exist as a fortified city in the Middle Bronze Age during the time of Abraham, because Genesis 19:1, when the two angels show up, where do they find Lot? Seated at the city gate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't have a city gate unless you have a fortified city.
Right.
We have a massive fortified city in the Middle Bronze Age. So it's the right place. It's also the right time. It fits the entire time frame for the whole biblical narrative that has anything to do with Sodom. But it also has the right stuff. It's got a large palace at the top. It's a large urban center. It's got all of the trappings of a very large, influential controlling city, of a city-state complex. It's got the right stuff as well. And my contribution to Dr. Collins' narrative of right place, right time, right stuff is now what we're demonstrating is it's also telling us the right story. And what story is that? The destruction event in Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25. Everything that we are finding is totally consistent with that biblical narrative.
Fascinating stuff. Now, on a personal note, and this is because I've got you on the line, and this is an area that I find really interesting, and I wrote a little bit about it in my last book, the dolmens of the Jordan Rift Valley. I understand that it's estimated that there may have been at one time these funerary monuments, or whatever they are, these dolmens, these structures made of slabs of stone, as many as 1,000 of them around Tal el-Hammam at one point. What are they, and to what period of history do they date?
Well, they date back to the early Bronze Age, perhaps the late Chalcolithic period as well. So they date back to about 3000 BC. They are made of megalithic blocks of stone. In other words, big blocks of stone. Megalithic means, big stone. There's, if you can picture standing stones with a flat tabletop stone on top of it. And they appear to be family-centered funerary monuments for the ancestral family. Now, they didn't bury people there, but and we're not sure about this, but we think that the flat stone top was used for a process that's referred to as excarnation. Now, we all know what incarnation is. That's, becoming flesh. We use that word a lot talking about Jesus. But excarnation is the actual opposite. When you take the flesh off the bones, that's excarnation. All right?
Okay.
And we believe that what the flat tops, tabletops were used for is that when a person died, they would put the body on top of the stone, and in a very short period of time, about 3 weeks actually, the birds of the air would come, pick all the soft tissue off the bone, and you'd have a nice clean skeleton 3 weeks later.
Okay.
They would then select 1 or 2 bones representing that person, and then once, maybe twice a year, probably at the equinoxes, they would open up the dolmen, add that bone to the ancestral bones, and maybe put in a few, offering trinkets, have a party, close the thing up, and then they leave it there till the next equinox. And so that's what we think the dolmens were for, because the few that we were able to excavate that had not already been robbed out, that's what we find. We find a few representative bones. We find, small pottery vessels, evidence of either, grain or wine offerings or that kind of stuff. That's what we find inside the dolmen.
Huh. Now, how about their astronomical orientation?
There doesn't seem to be a significant astronomical orientation, but there is, however, a physical orientation that we have observed, that they all seem to be aimed at the lower tell of Tal el-Hammam.
Oh.
Which is where the temple was located. In the lower tell is sort of circular in shape. In fact, when you look at it from like Google Maps, it looks like a crashed Starship Enterprise.
Huh.
But the lower tell is that more or less round area, and in the geographical center is the temple complex, and a lot of the dolmens are oriented to face the temple rather than to face a particular geographical, like, for example, face west. Since you can't look east because of the cliffside, they're not oriented towards the west where the sun would set,
right.
But they seem to be focused toward the general direction of the temple at Tal el-Hammam.
That's really interesting, and I'll tell you why I find this so intriguing. In the research that I did, and based on the concept of the divine council, the idea that the gods of the ancient world were real. In other words, God meant what he said when he said to Moses, "On this night I will execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt." He wasn't talking about just destroying blocks of wood and stone. Fallen angels, demons, whatever you want to call them, entities that represented themselves as gods to the ancient world. During the Exodus, there are several places where the Israelites stopped, where the place names seem to indicate a connection to the spirit realm, one called Ovoth, which is based on the word Ov, which means spirit or spirit of the dead. Another called Ai Ha'avarim, which means ruins or heaps of the travelers. And the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible describes travelers, especially in the context of Ezekiel 38:39, as traveler with a capital T, and some sort of spirit entity, rather than somebody just on vacation up and down the King's Highway. And in fact, when Moses was near the end of his life, God told him, climb this mountain of the travelers, mountain of the Avarim, in one of the Rephaim texts found at Ugarit, the Rephaim, which were considered spirits of the ancestral dead, especially the royal ancestors, the Rephaim were referred to as travelers or vagabonds. So when you connect all this together, it appears that plus the worship of Baal Peor, when Israel were in the plains of Moab, that these ruins of the travelers, ruins of the Avarim, heaps of the Avarim, might refer to these dolmens, these stones. And if these were oriented towards a temple at Sodom, well, then what was going on theologically, spiritually, religiously at Sodom that, above and beyond the stuff that we read about in the book of Genesis, that God might have found so necessary to put a stop to that he sent this meteorite to destroy the whole plain?
Oh, let me add something to bake your noodle here.
Okay.
Remember that Tal el-Hammam was destroyed 1700 BC during the time of Abraham.
Right.
It stood as a heap of ruin.
Yes.
For a very, very long time. And it stood still at the crossroads of the main caravan trails. So the trail of the travelers continued to go by the base of the Tell, even though nobody was living there.
Right.
And for a very long time, it was a heap of ruins, and even referred to as a heap of ruins.
Can you see Tel el-Hammam from Mount Nebo?
Absolutely, and vice versa.
Oh, right.
And vice versa. We got a clear line of sight. We can see it very, very well. If the air is clear, you can see it very clearly, and you get a lot of dust coming up from the deserts of northern Africa. So it's usually a somewhat hazy view. But yes, we have a very clear line of sight. In fact, I've got a very good picture of Tal el-Hammam from up there.
Okay. Okay. Well, now I'm even more excited about our trip back to Israel and Jordan in May. We were there this past May, and of course we were up Mount Nebo, and was able to talk about the Valley of the Travelers, which Ezekiel refers to in Ezekiel 39 in the context of the Gog-Magog war. The Valley of the Travelers east of the sea is where the army of Magog will be buried, according to the prophet. But if Tal el-Hammam is there, that adds even more context to it. So I am really looking forward to going back and being able to do a little preaching up there on top of Mount Nebo.
Well, you should come out there in February sometime, because that's our excavation season, and give you a tour of the place.
I'm going to make a note of that. As we get older, Sharon and I are starting to do a little more traveling around. That's my wife. We'll be leading this tour in May. But if we can ever get there while you all are working at Tal el-Hammam, we'd love to have an opportunity to see that. Phil, you mentioned a book, and I know Dr. Collins has a book out. Are you writing a book about this event and your research there, or where can people find out more about this research connected to this air blast event 3,700 years ago?
Well, I do have a paper that is based on my talk that's available up at ResearchGate as well as Academia.edu.
Okay.
So that can be downloaded. I do have a book out. It's based on my dissertation, so it's a little bit of an academic read, and it's now 3 years since I wrote it. So our research has gone on, and I will be doing an updated version probably in the next year or two, as time allows and as information comes in. But that book is available through TSU Press. It's not available on Amazon right now, but it's called The Destruction of Sodom, What We Have Learned from Tal el-Hammam and Its Neighbors. And you can contact me at TSU Press, at outlook.com, and order the book directly from TSU Press.
All right. Well, I'll put links in the show notes to that, also to your site at Academia.edu, which I mine frequently for the research that I've been doing. In fact, that's, for me now, that's become a fun Friday night pastime. You know, other people like to go out and dance or do whatever. For me, it's a fun Friday night finding a new paper on ancient Near Eastern cosmology.
Yeah, and half of your audience is thinking at this point, man, you need to get a life.
I know. Dr. Phillip Sylvia, he is the field archaeologist and supervisor, director of scientific analysis for the Tal el-Hammam Excavation Project. You can follow the website at talelhammam.com. Is it .com or .org? I've got it open here and I forgot to...
.com. And if that's too much to remember, just go to digsodom.com.
All right, dig Sodom.
It'll throw you right over to talelhammam.com.
Very good. Phil, I enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to do this again, especially as we get closer to your next book.
Okay. We can do that. I'll stay in touch.
Check the show notes at vftb.net or wherever else you might be accessing this podcast tonight, and follow that link to Dr. Sylvia's research on the Tal el-Hammam project, digsodom.com, and we will speak with him again as he gets closer to publishing that book, because they've got more research that they've not made public yet about the reason they're convinced that this particular site is the site of the biblical Sodom. And in the forthcoming book Sharon and I are working on for the fall, we will dig into a little bit more of the reasons why that location is significant. In fact, I touched on it in my book, Last Clash of the Titans, because the interview with Dr. Silvia was a few weeks before I had to finish the manuscript. So I had time to jam in a little reference to the conversation and why that particular location and the conversation that you just heard was significant to my thesis in Last Clash of the Titans. So anyway, appreciate their work there. I've actually made a financial contribution there to encourage that work. Because to me, it's extremely exciting that we Christians and Jews have a faith that's based on history, and it is being dug out of the ground by dedicated archaeologists like Dr. Silvia, the director of the dig, Dr. Stephen Collins, and the team there at Tal el-Hammam and elsewhere around the ancient Near East and all over the world. I can't say that I want to be the one crawling into caves to try to find stuff, but I really appreciate the guys who... men and women who actually do that really hard work and sometimes in really challenging conditions. So we will have more conversations on this topic in the future here on A View from the Bunker. And you'll see the results of such research and how it's, I hope, brought into a cohesive narrative in the future books that I'll write, again, God willing, and the presentations that Sharon and I will be honored to speak at in the future. We've got half a dozen of them, just about, on the board here for the rest of this year. The Defender Conference, of course, for Skywatch TV, August 2nd through 4th. That is sold out. Radisson Hotel in Branson, Missouri will have a full house that weekend. Dr. Michael Heiser, Pastor Carl Gallups, Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis, Dr. Michael Lake, Joel Richardson, Tom Horn, Sharon, me, Josh Peck, Stephen Bankars, Shelley Neese, author of The Copper Scroll Project, and Jim Barfield of The Copper Scroll Project will be there as well. So fascinating stuff that weekend. If you can't be there, if you didn't get in early, because it's sold out in like 5 days, streaming video is available, and you can find the sign-up link at defenderconference.com. It's on the front page there. Defenderconference.com gets you access to all of those presentations in high-definition video for 90 days from the start of the conference going forward. So don't miss out on that. 2 weekends later, we'll be talking about the Sons of God, Giants of Old at the Sons of God, Giants of Old Conference. That's August 16th through 18th in Lubbock, Texas. The Fellowship, the church there, pastored by Dan Crestman. Dr. Judd Burton coordinating that conference. Sharon and I honored to be two of the speakers there, and we hope we can see you there. That one is a very reasonably priced and a very intimate setting. Smaller conference, so you get to talk to people, and that's something we really appreciate. I will be the MC again this year for the True Legends Conference in Branson, September 13th through the 15th at the Mansion Theater, answering the alien question. Steve Quayle, L.A. Marzulli, Richard Dolan, Dr. Hugo DeGaris, George Knapp, Chase Kletsky, Timothy Alberino, and more. Don't wait. This one will sell out. Gen6, GENSIX.com for your tickets. The Unsealed Scroll Prophecy Conference coming to San Antonio the first weekend in October. Sharon and I honored to be speaking there with Rabbi Jonathan Kahn, Bill Salas, Carl Gallups, L.A. Marzulli, Ryan Peterson, Jim Barfield, Paul McGuire, and more. Sign up at unsealedscroll.org and save 20% with the promo code Gilbert20. And then the following weekend, October 11th through 13th, Hear the Watchmen come to California, the Hilton Irvine. L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, Pastor Paul Begley, Josh Peck, Gans Shimura, and more. To sign up, hearthewatchmen.com. Please leave us a review at Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find fine podcasts. Give us a like at Facebook, and remember, A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is Iron Bacon by Kevin MacLeod, our announcer, D.C. Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Next week, Islam and the Roots of Violent Mahdism. This is A View from the Bunker.